I don't think Dr. Kurtz needs any introduction from me at all, so without further ado, I will let him continue with his next lecture.
Okay, thank you, Robert. For those of you that were here yesterday, you'll realise this is the second part of a two-part lecture, but to a certain extent it is a standalone lecture because I knew there might be a split between who was here yesterday and today. Yesterday I looked at the factors that change hoof shape, and that included those from an early age where the hoof shape changes, shall we say, due to either programming or because it comes under an influence of conformation from an early age, and therefore produces a healthy changes. And we also looked at unhealthy changes. And we discussed the differences between an upright foot and a club foot, which seems to get confused by quite a few people, and they have two totally different causes. And we'll discuss today about shoeing options, which also are different for those two types of hoof shape. Well, at some point it might move forward. There we go. And I put this list up yesterday because this was the list that I came up with of factors that affect hoof shape, and we went through them. I'm not going to go through the list in its entirety looking at how we shoe for it, because there's certain things that, of course, we're not going to affect as a farrier, and we shouldn't try to affect breed, for example, an environment. That's we may change our shoeing to some extent, but we're not doing it to affect the hoof shape caused by the environment. Well, that was good, wasn't it? It went back. Okay, so why should we try and change hoof shape? There are a number of scientific reasons that we all know there hasn't been enough science on the horse's hoof and shoeing, but there has been some, and some of these authors gave reasons that we ought to think that hoof shape was important, and we ought to think that actually changing the shape of it is important to the horse's both its soundness, its long-term soundness, and its performance. Now, of course, there is always a slight debate about the chicken and egg. Is the hoof a different shape, left to right, because of lameness, or has lameness caused that hoof shape? And sometimes that is a little bit difficult to untangle, but we know that they are closely linked, so that probably means we ought to do something about it. Ducrot showed that horses with uneven hooves left competitive life early. Because of the records in Holland on warm bloods, they had vast numbers that they could analyse, and they showed that the more uneven-footed a horse was, then the more likely it was to disappear from competitive life. Now, we have to say that's possibly, because that's the main reason, because of unsoundness. So we also know that symmetry leads to longevity, and we know that hoof shape alters due to loading. We had a lot yesterday on how loading changes hoof shape. So this is quite an early CAT scan on the left of this little pony's right hind. So we'll look at it. So the technology has started to move on, and you get a finer, more detailed CAT scan now, but I still think it's quite remarkable. And we can see from this CAT scan just how deformed that horse's lower leg is from the fetlock. So it was quite a severe fetlock varus. And in running that CAT scan, we could even see how the hoof had deformed. And we'll now see, I hope, the video of this little miniature horse. Apparently it's not a pony, it's a miniature horse. I'm sure the horse is delighted that they don't have to be included in the description of this. I actually think they should call them bonsai horses because they've obviously been bred smaller and more crinkly. So we can see that actually the left hind isn't great, but it is the right hind that is walking totally on the lateral hoof wall. So this is an 18-month-old miniature horse. Too late to affect the deviation here, as we could have done in, shall we say, an 18-day-old foal we could have started on. And so we're having to manage this and shoe it, not to change it, but we need Farriery to help this be more comfortable. So if we look here, this has got a lateral extension on, but not the sort of lateral extension we use to just quite aggressively pull the leg out in this direction with a young foal and therefore influence the growth plates, especially in the lower leg. It has also got a medial lift here, so you'll see when it walks that it is to try and get a level footfall. So this is not a corrective shoe in that it's not trying to alter the conformation because it's too late. It is a shoe to make the miniature horse more comfortable. And I think we can see that that is a far more level landing. This was rescued by a fairly well-known charity, and they were quite keen, quite rightly, on helping it and getting it more comfortable. But they were also interested, of course, in the long term. So I did this work a couple of times with the farrier that worked for the charity, and then off it went. And this is at least 10 years ago. It has now passed away, which still seems like it passed away young, but probably they don't live for so long these time. So I'm a great believer in trimming and shoeing to the long axis. I always have been, and actually this has just been put on by the same principles, that where we couldn't trim the hoof to get it at 90 degrees to the long axis of the cannon, we had to use synthetic material. There's still often debate about this, and farriers tell me it doesn't work in every circumstance, and I say, well, if you can just describe the circumstances it doesn't work, then that would help me. And if that's in 5 or 10% of the cases, then I will stick with something that works in 90% of the cases. The other thing, of course, is the reason I believe in this technique of trimming is that it does seem that horses, whatever their deviation, need to have a cannon bone, which when it's on the ground, when it's in the stance phase, when it's weight bearing, needs to be erect at 90 degrees to the ground. And if we believe that, and you may choose not to believe that, you must believe that the ground surface of the foot, whether there's a shoe on it or not, should be at 90 degrees to that. Nothing else makes any sense. All right, let's look at one that is young and in many ways worse than the one we've just looked at. So this is a foal of about a month of age with quite a severe fetlock varus, and you can see the effect it's having when it walks. I'm not sure if I can make this run again with this. Okay. So let's just look at it one more time. So quite a worrying deviation. Now this is it 15 minutes later, so still partially sedated. You'll see the size of the extension on there and you'll see the way it walks. So you can see biomechanically it has a quite dramatic effect upon the limb, and only just as it goes to turn here does it wobble a little bit and that tarsus come out. So actually there was nothing wrong with the hock. It was all fetlock varus, and when we pulled the leg out by that extension, that immediately helped the hock. But that's only, as I say, a month old, and we would anticipate that we would get that, really correct it very well, and so much so that you wouldn't actually notice a problem at 4 months of age. But the reason I put that up is not because I was, as I'm often lecturing about, foals, but was just to show you the biomechanical effect of trimming a hoof and putting a shoe on it. And although we're not going to put an extension proportionally that big on a mature horse, in effect, when we put extensions on mature horses, we're putting them for more subtle deviations, and they do have an effect. This is actually the picture doesn't totally tell the story. It is behind. It does give some caudal support, but actually it's really wide laterally. But I just want to show you the size of that. So if we put on a shoe of any type that has lateral extension, common sense, and that's always a dangerous thing, would say that we will increase the leverage. So this is not the pressure mat reading of that foal that I've just shown you, but it's one not quite as severe, but very similar. In other words, a fetlock varus on the left hind. And again, we shouldn't be surprised by this loading. All the loading is on the lateral side. In fact, the medial side, it's not weight bearing at all. Just like both that foal that I showed you and the miniature. So the thing is, if we put a lateral extension here, out here, we would expect, wouldn't we, to create a fulcrum point and actually increase our leverage here. So we would increase loading. That common sense tells us that's what will happen. And if we do that, we're even more overloading the hoof this side, so we're not likely to help it. But let's see what does happen when we put an extension on. So this is the same foot over here with a lateral extension. So very similar to that foal I showed you. And look what happens. The loading actually moves over to this side. Yes, there is some loading here, but nothing like the degree of difference here. And look, there's quite some loading medially. So how can this happen? Well, it happens because a leg is not a two-dimensional object, and it's not working two-dimensionally. If we put an extension on here, we move the leg out in this direction, or the foot attached to the leg out in this direction in relation to the body, and if we do that, we bring the medial side more to the ground, and we see that there. Okay, this is not a scientific study. I did this as a one-off for this sort of lecture. But there had to be an explanation as to why, when we take a foot that's loading like this, and we put more shoe this side, it actually switches the loading to this side. So I was half anticipating this when I took a foal and did that with it. So we can relate that to when we put a far lesser radical extension on a foot. So this is quite a small extension. The reason that shoe's been just seated out there is to stretch the shoe so we can fit it wider. This is the same shoe as shown here. So this doesn't look particularly wide, but you can see it comes out from the margin of the hoof by probably 10 mil or so, as opposed to this side where it's about 1 mil fitted out. So that is an extension. Anything outside the normal periphery of the hoof is an extension. So this one we're going to show is a little bit more. This is a sports horse, mature sports horse at a moderate level that does okay and keeps the owner happy. And we can see this is at, I don't know what it was, 8 or 9 years of age. It has a fetlock varus to the left hind. Again, and we can just see that curvature there, and we can see how the hoof is running this way a little bit. If we see it after shoeing, it does look somewhat improved. So how could it be improved if we have all growth plates fixed? Well, of course, there is some medial-lateral laxity in joints. Despite the fact they're hinge joints in the lower leg, there is some. So actually you do get some real improvement where you move this over here. But mainly it's just positional because the horse has again positioned its leg a little bit more this way. So you can see this lateral extension, and it gives the effect that that is a balanced foot and leg now with about an equal amount of shoe either side. But let's see how much had to be put on there to do that. So now you can see this is actually quite a large extension where it had to be double fullered to stretch the metal to give it enough, and an extra nail hole put in here because by now these nail holes would be way too wide. So it is quite a large extension, larger than the photograph shows. And again, you can see how much has been hung out the side here. But again, this really looks quite good. So a friend of mine, I don't tend to do it, but on balance diagrams or photographs, turns this into a triangle from the middle of the fetlock. And it's quite a good guide, and you can see there's a sort of an equilateral triangle formed by that. But again, the reason I wanted to put that there is to say that by doing this, we are not creating leverage this side, or we shouldn't be. We are shifting loading to the inside where it's more able to take it. Having said that, I caught up with this horse 3 years later because it was a referral into the Rossdale Hospital. Actually, I'm going to show you two more views of it first of all. All right, that's just a lower, a more standing dorsal palmar view, and just to show again the changes from here unshod, where we can see this curvature more, to here shod, and again it really doesn't look much, but you've seen how much extension was put there. All right, let's see it 3 or 4 years later when I had a look at it. Now, the farrier who it was handed back to had continued to put quite a large extension on. But now we can see it is pulling the foot too far this way. So the only advice was, well, back off from that and just try and keep the hoof in the middle of this pastern alignment. And to the best of my knowledge, that's what's now been done. All right, I posed the question yesterday, upright or club, and said that once you understand the different definition, there is a clear difference between this foot and this foot. The only similarity is they both have a steep dorsal hoof wall angle. Otherwise, they have different causes, they look different, and we need to shoe them differently. So I think the danger actually with both of them, there is another link. The danger with both of them is that we aggressively want to make a pair of feet. And of course, we're always under that pressure from owners. But I think if we trim this one down too far and try and get the heel height the same as this, we do overload this foot, and what you'll tend to get is this one flattening off more. At this present time, it's still relatively or a little bit steeper than would be normally expected for a middle-aged horse. And it will flatten more because it will switch the loading from its right fore to its left fore more. The more this is comfortable, the more it will load it. The other thing that might happen, especially if we tend to trim more off the heel than the toe, is that we will overload the tendon and the check ligament. So we still need to maintain the difference. That doesn't mean we totally accept it and don't try and at least improve it, but I would always advise against aggressively trying to make this foot look like this one. Difficult one to get over to the horse owners. From the point of view of clubfoot, of course, this is really a diagram from a foal having a flexural deformity and lifting its heel off the ground. And this is when it has ultimately become a clubfoot, and I showed that process going on photographically yesterday, and you could see the clear starting point like this and the clear ending point just like this. But we are often left with club feet that look like this, and we have to shoe them. This is a horse that used to come in again to Rossdale's, and it used to come in every June for quite a few years. I've only got 2 pictures. But initially, the clubfoot had been trimmed down quite aggressively because the owner said, I want the angle to be the same as this, and the farrier has to pay a mortgage, so that's what they did. And this did go lame in the check ligament region, or in the check ligament. And so initially we actually wedged it back up, which really confounded the owner, who would have been demanding that her farrier cut it down, and we wedged it up. And that was, what I'd do now is I'd use synthetic material, probably adhere to get a lift. But what I did is I welded 2 wedge pads, or they were rim wedge pads together. So getting about a 10-degree lift here. And the horse went sound fairly quickly. And so after 3 months, a couple of shoons, we thought, well, we'll try and get it down a bit. And actually it went lame again. And so we had to keep going for 3 months, and we took 1 wedge off, and then finally we had a sound horse. And it's very difficult. It's just as difficult for me. I really want to get my nippers into the heel of this foot. Every time I shot it, I really wanted to nip it down. So it's quite a discipline to keep trying to shoe it in this manner. And we had this angle and this X-ray, and we knew the horse was sound, and it stayed sound, to my knowledge, for 7 years. It may well have stayed sound longer, but I had an association with it for 7 years, and it did its job for its owner. So the lesson with club feet is not to be too aggressive. I don't accept when farriers say you must never trim the heel. I think that's daft. I think they will get even more out of balance that way. I think a rocker toe really helps them, because again, it's easing the breakover and the leverage, especially on the deep digital flexor tendon. We now know when we put any sort of breakover on a shoe, we do not speed the breakover up, but we do alleviate the peaks of tendon pull. Obviously, the amount of force required to get that horse from A to B remains the same, whatever we do there. So we can't get rid of that weight and that force, but what we can do is stretch it over a longer period, and that's apparently what happens during the break-off phase. It is a longer period, and therefore there is less peaks of stress on the tendon there. So I showed this picture yesterday of a thoroughbred that had a fractured pastern 7 months previously, and how this hoof had become more upright, and this hoof may have remained the same or slightly flattened off. But today we have to think about, how do we shoe it? Can we get this back to being a pair? Because, as I showed right at the start, we know that paired hooves horses are more sound. Now, it had finished its career, and it was probably going on to carrying on its life in breeding. But I would say that if now that injury is resolved, and I want to point out again that these are 2 healthy frogs, and everything else about these hooves is healthy. It's just that 15 mil difference is way above what we would expect, because it's very rare for a horse to have a perfect pair, but it's extraordinarily rare for them to have a 10% difference in width. So I think we just have to treat this as the foot that's still probably being overloaded. We can shoe it fairly conventionally. We need to pull it together if it's flattening off. We need to make sure that the toe isn't migrating forward, and that does look just a little bit stretched there. And on this foot, the simple thing is to shoe with a little bit more width. Now, I know as well, actually, because I hadn't realised yesterday, but between my laptop and the projector, you can probably see that these pictures have been compressed. So this is quite a very typical wide thoroughbred foot that's as wide as it is long, and this was not quite as contracted as this. Now, years ago, we were always taught that if we put pressure on this frog, it will open the heels. And yet the experience with heart bars and laminitics, and now heart bars are used for a lot of things, that if you use a heart bar for a considerable period, then in actual fact you get the opposite. So you do get a narrowing of heel with heart bar. So I wouldn't suggest that's a cure for this and a way to open it out. And that's probably because the frog plate of a heart bar is almost pushing up inside, and so it has to, there's a finite amount of hoof wall, and in reaction to that, it has to pull it in. So that's not my suggested fix for this. My suggested fix is actually just a shoe with additional width, and I'd say keep your fingers crossed. With the resolution of the lameness issue, there is no doubt that these do improve, but never in my experience do they once again become the width that they were before. So we should see some improvement. If there's more equal loading between the limbs, then this should open out, and this we may well be able to keep pulling it together, and it would just come in a few mils. So how do we cope with this? I showed how through data that I got from my PhD and data from Anderson and McElraith, we can see that in the first 2 years of life of a foal, there's quite a considerable descent of the dorsal hoof wall angle from very nearly 60% down to well under 50. And this is based on thoroughbreds. You'd expect other breeds to be slightly steeper and to remain steeper. But how should this affect the way we trim? Well, the first thing is we mustn't look at a 3-month-old foal and just judge it by that dorsal hoof wall angle and say, it's a club foot, I'm going to correct it, because it's certainly not true that almost 50% of thoroughbred foals at 3 months have a club foot. But I think, and a lady yesterday pointed out, and she did say that I extrapolated, and I made it quite clear in my lecture that I was not extrapolating that this carries on, but it's certainly not going to just suddenly stop there, is it, this curve? We can see it is flattening out. And what I actually said was there was anecdotal evidence, and I believe that in my observations, that horses do become a lower dorsal hoof wall angle throughout their lives. So we need to take that into account when we're showing a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, and nowadays we're sometimes showing 25-year-old horses. We shouldn't be obsessed about trimming the dorsal hoof wall to achieve what we think is a perfect angle, and we shouldn't imagine that what was an ideal angle for that individual horse is the same 5 years later. So this was the teaser blue that, because I had a pressure mat in the back of my van for my studies, I was able to use it for a couple of other things. And we can see this is the pressure mat, and I'm sorry for those of you because the screen's quite low, but we can see there's no loading on the dorsal hoof wall, and after 6 weeks it's because he's worn those. So I asked my apprentice then, who was an exceptionally good apprentice, to trim this pony as well as possible. You can see again there that it had really perfect horn, no blemishes, very strong horn, and then we'd put it on the pressure mat. And he was mortified by the fact that there wasn't equal loading all the way around. You can see the frog here and a little bit more of the frog there. So I think it's just he'd trimmed it down quite low, and it's the frog holding this heel off the ground. It certainly wasn't because he'd trimmed it unevenly. But it just shows you that when we think we've trimmed a foot really evenly, and as I say, it was very good, and he took a lot of time doing this, loading it does not become even. And just to go back, those of you that can see that, will see that the pattern is totally differently. He has got it loading on the dorsum, the toe again, but he's actually changed the loading quite a bit. So then we really had a little bit of fun with this pony. What we did was we got some adhere because it meant we could remove it 10 minutes later. Built the heel up here by about 10 mil, so I don't know what that is, a third of an inch or something. And on this foot, on the right fore, we built the toe up by about the same amount. And we tried to trim it evenly so there was even loading across it. And this is the picture again that we got. We did show what has been shown more scientifically than one single study can show, is that when we elevate heels, so when we wedge heels, we do get what most farriers have guessed. We get increased loading at the heel, which can be damaging in the long term, but we also get increased loading at the dorsum. You can probably just make out that that is a little bit more red there. And that's what the scientific study by Jenny Hagen in Germany shows over a lot more than I've done there. And of course, that's because we are tipping it forward onto its dorsum, so we're increasing the loading there. From the point of view of elevating the toe, and obviously we can say that is like a horse having its toes left too long, or the farrier not trimming enough off the toes, or over trimming the heels. We can see that, yes, we get loading at the toe because there's leverage, but look what happens at the back of the foot. Even the bulbs of the heel are on the ground, and there's really excessive overloading of the heel. Again, this is only showing probably what we've guessed at quite a bit in recent years. So long toes and overloaded heels and neglected feet all increase loading quite a lot in the caudal area of the foot, but they also increase that leverage at the toe. So although I've put this into graphs, the graphs don't actually matter because it's a one-off, it's not a scientific study. The real message from this is not this individual pony. The real message from this is just how much trimming and altering angles changes loading. It's really quite dramatic how much we can change the loading. So the message from it is that beneficially, if we get it right, we can be really beneficial, but if we get it wrong, we can be really detrimental to the horse. So that's the only message from this, not those individual graphs and those individual graphics, is that it's just how much effect we can have just with a rasp and glue or a shoe. So I've been using this diagram for over 20 years, and I still stick by it. Most people now accept this. I would say even 20 years ago, most people were understanding that the dorsal hoof wall ought to be parallel with the parietal surface of the distal phalanx. Having said that, of course, the other thing we understand is if we do this aggressively and imagine the hoof is two-dimensional and we're destroying those structures of the hoof wall that I showed yesterday, which are quite complex, and it's not the same all the way through it. So at your risk do you go over rasping the hoof wall. And in fact, there's far better ways of changing our point of breakover, or our leverage point, if you want to call it. And of course, this is quite just a subtle change with a shoe that's perhaps just had the toe safed off. Of course, we know there are shoeing programs or shoeing regimes for bringing the shoe further back or being far more radical than this. And I would suggest that that's the way the craft is moving, quite rightly, and trying to get away from this awful trim the toe back when actually there isn't toe to trim back, but altering the mechanics on the shoe. And we've even almost moved on from the natural balance shoe, which is quite square across and has some roll, to the shoes now that actually use this very good weight-bearing area, and yet mechanically the point of breakover is back here. In other words, we don't need to trim that foot off there. I know there's still pressure on us often to do that, and I don't know how we get that message across, but it's far easier to do the work here than destroy the structure of the hoof wall here. And I showed this picture yesterday of a bull-nosed foot. I have to show quite dramatic pictures to get the message across. You probably don't even need a radiograph to know what's going on here. Whenever you see this curvature and only the bottom point has been caused by the rasp, this is a genuine deformation, plastic deformation of the hoof wall, so it has been bent under. And when you see this broken back hoof pass nexus, you know the distal phalanx is going to be quite a long way up there, and it's either going to be horizontal or tipped back, in other words, a negative rotation. So that's its radiograph. So quite a, shall we say, a poor picture that we've got there, so we shouldn't be surprised at this. But I actually think with persistence, these are probably the easiest things to put right. And I think Farriery comes into its own with bullnose foot. And you can see from this picture it's got an aluminium egg bar on, so somebody was concerned about it, spent more time and more money on it. I don't know how long it had been between shoeings, but it's actually the trim that will fix this most of all. And that looks quite funny because you can see that, and I know it's fractionally out of focus, but wait till you see the next picture, which is even more out of focus. So having dropped the toe, so when people say to me, oh, you mean you're going to get the toe back? No, I'm going to drop the toe. We want this to rotate down here. So it's actually nothing to do with rasping distance off there. It's all to do with how much we dare reduce the depth here. And you do have to be careful because it has distorted the sensitive tissue when you have this foot. And sometimes it can catch you unawares. But you need to really, really take as much as you can down. So you want to drop this down here. So it has this peculiar shape. And then, whereas 30 years ago I was told you must never, never, never put on raise the heel for the reasons I showed you in the previous pictures. But in actual fact, with these cases temporarily, I love to put on this shoe a PM pad, and it has a synthetic frog, and we fill the gap in between with dental impression material. So this is one of the things that we've really moved on in Farrier, and I think we've come to understand that digital support is a way to go. For me, this is the best way to re-engage the frog and the caudal foot with the ground. There are other pads there. Some of them have a solid frog, but I really like this because under the other side of this it's hollow, and you can fill it with this dental impression material, and it really re-engages the whole of the foot. So any of you that haven't tried these, I would suggest you try them, as a number of the Farrier suppliers sell them. So they're PM pads and PM material. I'm sure most of you have used dental impression material because we've been using it for quite a few years in other shoeing regimes. So it's a very, very robust pad. You will, I think I can almost guarantee you'll be able to refit it. And so you refit it once and then go onto a flat pad that also has that synthetic frog in there. And usually 2 shoeings, you will get this shape back to an almost normal shape. I can tell you that. So that's why it's very rewarding for a farrier to work on this. You probably need to shorten the shoeing cycle to a maximum of 5 weeks. But if you do that, if you're persistent, if you're brave with your trimming here, then I think it's something that you will rechange the hoof back to a good shape, and with all the benefits that come with that. All right, another way of using the digit, or I should say giving digital support as a slightly more old-fashioned way, is with a heart bar. But this heart bar is the shoe is bearing weight around the front half of the foot and then only the frog. Again, I hope it's clear, but there's a gap. In other words, the heels have been floated. And I did this on a number of horses and got great results. And the reason I got great results, I think, is the answer is what I was talking about yesterday, about how if we unload the foot, hoof doesn't compress as much, and therefore it is true to say it grows faster. It doesn't generate any more horn at the coronary band, at the germinative layer, but it does grow faster. In other words, it comes down quicker. And people that have tried this, actually, they say it's remarkable how quick the hoof grows here. Now, you might say, well, when it meets the shoe again, after a few shoeings, aren't we back to the same problem? That an overloaded heel will compress that heel again and we're back to square one. The point is, if you can keep on top of it, if you can improve that foot and then get the foot under the body weight, which you should do, then that effect of overloading the heels is reduced. So you can get out of this cycle. The other thing is, this is a relatively old-fashioned way of doing it now, and I would suggest that you can actually do it with one of those flat pads with the dental impression material, and you'll achieve the same thing. But I wanted to show that because that was a way of trying to do this 20 odd years ago when we probably we didn't quite understand what was going on with the hoof as much. We just thought it was generating more horn cells, but it's not. It's just not compressing the foot as much. So I'm a great believer in dorsopalmar balance of a straight hoof pattern axis in athletic horses. I don't particularly care what this angle is, but I think the alignment's important because I don't think we can change the angle. We can change this axis by elevating or by lowering the heel. We can change the axis either negatively or positively, but we can't affect the overall angle. So I don't care, but I do like alignment. I think horses are sounder the better they're aligned. And the reason I said athletic horses, of course, working horses and cob types, they are often quite healthy having a positive hoof pattern axis. So I'm saying the more athletic types, we have the warm bloods and the thoroughbreds. So that diagram that I just showed earlier wasn't really an exaggeration, was it, with the toe there? This horse has been neglected because the shoes have been left on for 10 weeks. And possibly the shoeing didn't get the toe back enough in the first place. As I pointed out yesterday, the farrier that did this actually went to the trouble of hand making an aluminium shoe. So they were doing their best, but this is obviously appalling, and you can't really see the crack there, but we're getting the crack. So this is 2 shoeings later. I'm always wary when I show this in lectures to horse owners because they think everything can be fixed in 1 shoeing or 2 shoeing, and that's not true. But in cases like this, it is true that underneath a distorted hoof like this, there is a pretty good shape trying to get out. So we now have a good hoof pattern axis, we have a good straight strong heel, and we have a good angle and strong horn. This was the Arabian stallion that I showed that ran up and down the fence because there were mares the other side of it, day in, day out, and wore its hooves like this. And this is it shod on that's about as much snow as we get in Newmarket actually, every year. And I'm not exaggerating, but so you can see it's been shod. I hate saying it's been shod with lateral support because how can you support something when there's just air above it? I think, again, it's that same effect that I showed, that if you shoe with more on one side of the foot than the other, then you actually move the foot slightly in that direction in relation to the body, and therefore you even out compression. So that's relatively straightforward shoeing with a very ordinary shoe with a toe clip, but just showing how the hoof can come back into shape quite quickly despite this gross distortion because of wear. And I showed this one yesterday which had the heel injury, and of course when we've got this much disruption to the germinative layer, it's never going to produce organised horn. So for the rest of this horse's life, it is going to have this lesion. Nobody's yet come up with a way of repairing that so that we then get normal horn growing there. So it's going to be up to us to try and manage it. Now, when I started, we would have shod, we would follow the outline of the foot, even if it was distorted. We wouldn't try and make it symmetrical. So this isn't just trying to make a full hoof capsule symmetrical. It's actually ignoring the fact that underneath there is nothing here, but we've put the shoe on there. So why have we done that? Well, we haven't changed the loading because the horse weighs the same and it's still distributing its weight here. But we've probably helped with everything above that because we're helping to hold the leg in a far better place, a far better position, and in motion it's not going to have this area here to collapse over. So we have to do a repair job, and obviously the Play-Doh is just there to exclude the glue from where we don't want it. and that's the finished repair job. The only thing is that the owner has to know is that however well you repair this, and you can do excellent repairs with acrylics these days, acrylics and fiberglass, you cannot repair something that big with acrylic without using a strengthening of fiberglass. But you have to tell the owner that actually this will do really well for at least 3 months, but ultimately you've got to replace it. The natural oils in the hoof will get behind it. It'll have grown down there, and this area of hoof that isn't producing good horn will come down with it. So for as long as this horse lives, if you want to keep it sound, this repair will have to be done every few months, and that's the owner's choice, you know, whether they do that, but that would be my advice. So these two are the same horse. This is different, but you can see I've aligned the frogs, and they were about the same size foot. So what I really wanted to say was really about breakover and getting the toe back, and how this was well shod, but it was after 10 weeks, so it had gone a bit too long. And of course the shoe's grown forward with the foot. The shoe is worn, so that probably has helped the breakover a bit. But this is a shoe that's been put on, and the breakover point is here. You can see it's been rocketed back to about this point. Sorry, it's about to this point, just above this line. And I want to compare it with a natural balance shoe, which is bringing the breakover point a little bit further back. A lot of people are far more radical than this, and as I say, you now have shoes where instead of just coming across square, in actual fact, the rolling starts further back but goes further forward. So I think we've sort of moved on in that respect now. So how do we change hoof shape? By altering compression with trimming. So I tried to show that yesterday, that compression affects hoof growth affects hoof shape. So this is the sort of counterpoint to that diagram I showed from the bottom of the foot, that I think it's pretty obvious to everybody what goes on here, and just nipping the length of foot down actually brings the toe point back there. Without rasping the toe back, just nipping it down brings it back. It's at the heel that's more interesting, and those that know me will know that this bizarre guidance to trim the foot to the widest part of the frog, which is there, will result in a gallon of blood on the ground. And so I now hear that it's trim it to the widest, highest point of the frog, when actually the people that say that actually mean the highest, lowest point, don't they? Because horses don't walk around or stand with their feet upside down. But the point is, so I don't think there's an exact point to trim the heel back to. So all I say is get the toe back and get the heel back. But this is the bit that still baffles a bit our colleagues in the veterinary profession, and yet this is the important bit. Everybody knows about this, and there's ways of fixing a long toe. There's 3 or 4 ways of fixing a long toe. But it is getting the heel back that's the important part, and that's the secret of good shoeing and getting a hoof shape back more normal. This is actually unloading a heel where you can see there's an awful abscess there, or you can see some of the pus. So of course we can unload that there, and growth will be accelerated there by it being unloaded. This is a foot where I gave it the Mustang roll, as sometimes called. Again, an awful name, but I alleviated breakover there. And because I trimmed the flare here back, you can see we're actually got loading just on the heel. And if we do that, because we've unloaded the quarter, you will get faster growth there, but you will get straighter growth because it hasn't been loaded, and therefore it's not leveraging out the a flare there. So we can focus loading and unloading with shoeing. So that's an important thing to say. So without saying exactly and being perspective, you can see there are different ways of unloading or loading the hoof. We always have to bear in mind the horse has not changed its weight. The amount of weight coming down the leg hasn't changed. So all we can do is move things around. If we alleviate one area, we put more loading on the other. And we can alter leverage, which was the point of this here, and here, and that shoe that I showed in the last slide. So in summary, we know that loading affects hoof growth. The more either an individual area is loaded, that will slow hoof growth, or the whole foot in general. If you unload it, it will accelerate in growth. But I've tried to show that we can manipulate loading, and I take you back to that pressure mat where I said that common sense tells us we would load the lateral heel more, but by putting that extension on, the opposite happens because the horse moves and it's three-dimensional, not two-dimensional. And so that's why that happens. So we can manipulate loading. We know that loading affects hoof growth. But we need focused strategies, and that includes all of you. Once you understand a general principle, then often people have bright ideas of how to apply that in detail, not just to individual cases, but in general. So that's what I'm looking forward to more, is I don't think we're ever going to have a simple formula for shoeing a horse, but we ought to have formulas that are more focused on shall we say, individual problems. Thank you very much for your time.
Right.